All right, good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome everybody to the event tonight. My name is JT Malazri. I'm the chair of mission advancement for ULI Memphis here. I have the honor of introducing to you our speaker for tonight. The world is noticing Oklahoma City's remarkable renaissance and its popular four-term mayor, Mick Cornett. His list of awards includes nods in urban design, health, sports, and the arts. Newsweek calls him one of the 5 most innovative mayors in the country. London-based World Mayors listed him as number 2 mayor in the world, and Governing Magazine named him the Public Official of the Year. Best known for helping Oklahoma City attract an NBA franchise and putting Oklahoma City on a diet, Cornett also led the charge to pass MAPS 3, an innovative $800 million investment in parks, urban transit, wellness centers, and infrastructure that will dramatically reshape Oklahoma City and enhance the quality of life for its residents. In 2018, Cornett stepped down after 14 years as the Oklahoma City's mayor, and as of last September, released his new book, The Next American City. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mick Cornett.
All right. Thanks, JT. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you all. Thank you very much. It is great to be back in Memphis. I think the last time I was here was when the Grizzlies beat us in the playoffs. So it's nice to be welcomed back, and hopefully those days can return. There's nothing better than that rivalry, and I'd like to see it return very, very soon. I had an opportunity today to get a little tour of what's going on here. And first of all, congratulations. I've always said that a city needs to know what's next. In other words, you always have to have projects coming, and you need that momentum. And in Memphis, it seems like there's always something to look forward to. And you'd be surprised at how many cities around the country you just feel that stagnation, and whatever public initiatives or private sector initiatives have been rolling out one after one, all of a sudden there's some lull, and that lull can be really tough to overcome and to get started again. No city in American history, I don't believe, has ever come as far as fast as Oklahoma City. Now that's partially because it really was bad in the early 1990s. I imagine in a room like this, and it being as close as it is, there was people that probably visited Oklahoma City in the 90s. Anybody in here? Okay. And if that's the last time you've come, there's probably this image you have of Oklahoma City that is just wretched. And I grew up in Oklahoma City, and you know, when it's your city, you don't really know how bad it is. But ultimately, we got some very strong lessons from corporate America in that how our inattention to detail, our lack of care about design, had taken its toll. And I'll get into that because The Next American City, in my book, I talk a third about Oklahoma City, a third about me, and then a third about the rest of the country. And there is this urbanization that's taking place right now, and this millennial generation, as well as the generation coming in behind it, appear to be very mobile, very selective, and they are choosing the city of their choice. And so, because of the rapid growth in population that's expected in the mid-sized metro cities like Memphis, like Oklahoma City, there's a great opportunity right now to be purposeful in what type of city are we trying to create. And by a percentage basis, there's always this suspicion that New York's going to grow, and LA is going to grow, and Chicago's going to grow. They probably will grow, but it will not be at the percentage of the mid-sized metro cities. The millennial generation, and again, that generation coming in just behind it, is placing a higher value on things like traffic congestion, cost of living, and those types of amenities that might not have been at the top of the list of previous generations. Now, the quality of life, the hassles of living in that community are all very much relevant. And that's a big opportunity for Oklahoma City, Memphis, and other places of similar size. So you see here on the graphic, by 2050, 70% of the human family will live in cities. So this urbanization is not just in the United States, it's all over the world. And 60% of those urban spaces have yet to be built. And the opportunity there is to look around and see what type of city do we want to create. How can the public sector work with the private sector and start determining market trends and create a city that's going to allow us to be competitive with those other cities to bring in the highly educated 20-somethings that we all are trying to attract. It's the greatest force shaping in our future, and in the book we discuss 4 key principles that we believe are going to ensure growing cities provide great experiences. And so there are 4 pillars for urban growth, and you see them here in Memphis, you see them in Oklahoma City now. But first is economic strength and diversity, build wealth, jobs, and opportunity. It's amazing to me that a strong economy allows you to do things. And I think corporate America gets beat up a lot. Chambers of commerce get beat up a lot. Private sector gets beat up a lot these days in a lot of political discussions. But the reality is, only with a strong economy are you going to have the tax base, you're going to be able to create the jobs that are going to allow you to invest in urban spaces that are going to attract people. We're also going to talk in a minute here about civic pride and social cohesion, because what people think and feel about their city is indeed very, very important. I think it's important to create a culture of wellness, and in Oklahoma City that meant some very honest conversations about some very tough topics. And we want to have strong, sustainable cities, and as you know, that next generation is less enamored with the automobile than my generation was. I think many of them would prefer to live in a community where they don't have to own a car if that were a viable place. Now, the reality is, in any city that might be Western, and I know Memphis might be Western depending on where you are, but in any city that developed mostly in the 20th century, it was generally designed around the automobile. And the way I've described it in Oklahoma City is that we had built an incredible quality of life if you happened to be a car. If you were a car, we had built the entire city to benefit you. But if you were a person, you were seemingly combating the automobile at every turn. Let's start with economic strength and diversity, and a quick story about Oklahoma City that really put the light bulb on for civic leadership. The 1980s were a really rough time for Oklahoma's economy. Now, I'm going to give you some numbers, and I want you to think through an economy going through this all at the same time. Our leading industry in the 1980s was oil and gas. The price went from $40 a barrel to $10. 200 banks failed in the decade of the 1980s in Oklahoma. You may not have thought we had 200 banks. 200 banks failed. It took with it our commercial real estate market, because almost every deal was upside down. The banks were having to inherit properties that they didn't really want. And so you lose your leading industry, you lose your banking system, you lose your commercial real estate industry, and you can imagine how bad the 1980s were for Oklahoma and Oklahoma City. And it got worse just about every year. 82 was the beginning of it, and then 83 was worse, and 84 was worse, and 85 was worse. Finally, we bottomed out in about 1987. And that was the year that Oklahoma City elected a business-minded mayor named Ron Norick. Now, Ron Norick got to office by promising jobs. He says, we're going to create jobs. And of course, he won the election, because that was what everybody was clamoring for, and nobody was arguing. We had to have jobs in our city. And so, by coincidence, came what I guess was the economic development opportunity of the decade, sort of the Amazon of the 1980s. United Airlines announced they were going to build a maintenance facility somewhere in the United States. And so cities started lining up to compete for it. And no city was as hungry for Oklahoma City and this brand new mayor who had promised jobs. And so he starts trying to figure out how he's going to create an incentive package that's going to impress United. He even goes to the citizens and convinces them to pass a sales tax contingent on United coming, where Oklahoma City will basically build the facility for United Airlines, about $150 million in 1990. He then went to the state and got the state to call a special session of the legislature, and they passed another incentive. And so Oklahoma City's incentive package was incredibly, not only complex, but large. And United, who didn't even have Oklahoma City on its radar when the process started, saw Oklahoma City and saw how intent the mayor was on winning this, saw Oklahoma City's name continue to rise as they cut off the list of cities. And finally, in a now famous day in Oklahoma City history, United's CEO called a press conference in Chicago, and he welcomed in the cities for a final pitch, and then they called a press conference and said, we're going to build this facility in Indianapolis. And that's about how quiet it was in Oklahoma City. Because it was such a public process, it was very high profile. You know, a lot of economic development ventures are kind of below the radar screen, and the general public sometimes is not even aware that it's going on. Well, because of the sales tax election, this was on the front pages of every paper. It was leading the 10 o'clock news. The news stations were in Chicago for the announcement because we had our hopes up. We knew that incentive package was incredibly generous. And so the mayor, to his credit, did two proactive things. He first insisted United tell us where we went wrong. And United did not want to talk about the process. They said, Mayor, no hard feelings, no need to discuss it. You finished second. And by the way, you were the most courteous, you were the most complete, you hit every deadline. He was trying to make us feel good. And all that was fine, but we needed to know because he said, we've got to learn from this, so maybe we'll get the next one. United realized that that probably was a quality that they could offer back. So they disclosed that unbeknownst to the city of Oklahoma City, they had sent in some mid-level executives and their spouses and had them spend a weekend in downtown Oklahoma City. When they reported back to the board came to the conclusion that they couldn't imagine their employees living there. We could no longer buy the attention of corporate America at any price, seemingly. And so the mayor did the next proactive thing. He went to Indianapolis. Now, he did not move there, but I assure you at this stage of his political career, it probably seemed like it might be a good idea. And when he got to Indianapolis, he saw a downtown that was vibrant. He saw sports arenas and sports teams. He saw water features. He saw hotels and retails. Well, compare that to Oklahoma City. We were down to one hotel downtown in Oklahoma City, and it was struggling. We had virtually no retail. The only people that lived downtown were in jail. And so you take all of these elements, and meanwhile, life in the suburbs was going great. And it's where the majority of people lived. It's where they went to church. It's where they went to work. And downtown was just kind of ignored. Now, there were a lot of people that worked downtown, but we had built really big streets to make sure they didn't have to stay down there very long. And so we had 5-lane, one-way streets. And so when 5 o'clock came, people could get on the one-way streets to the interstate highway and get back to the suburbs where they belonged. And somebody could turn the lights out, and downtown was just completely dead after 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock on a weekday morning. And so the mayor was realizing that no one from the outside was going to invest in Oklahoma City until Oklahoma City invested in Oklahoma City. We had to invest in ourselves first. And that was a critical turning point in Oklahoma City's ascension. He remembered that the citizens had passed that sales tax for corporate incentives. So he went back to him and thought to himself, well, maybe they'll pass one for us. If we were ready to pass a sales tax to give away, maybe they'll pass a sales tax to build projects. Well, they did. He passed what was called MAPs, Metropolitan Area Projects. It built a new ballpark downtown, very similar to what you have in a very similar location, built in the downtown area. He put a canal in an old abandoned warehouse district that we intended to make into an entertainment district. And I can tell you that took a lot of vision. Built a new library, built a new performing arts center, some improvements on the fairgrounds and some typical things. The mayor even had the audacity to believe that we could put water in the river. Now, I know in Memphis that probably seems like it needs a little explanation. After all, your river came complete with water. But I grew up in a city that had a big ditch downtown that the grown-ups called the river. The city of Oklahoma City actually had a line item in its budget to mow the river twice a year. The idea was, with maps, we would build some low water dams and impound the water when it rained, and we wouldn't let the rain go. We would just stop that water right there and really create river lakes. And so at least we'd have water in the river. I mean, it wouldn't be a river that flowed anywhere, but at least there'd be water in the river. And believe me, that met every expectation of every voter. Just having water in the river would be enough. There would not need to be any development. Nothing would need to come after that. Just put some water in the river. And maps passed. It just barely passed, but it passed. Here's the interesting thing that ensued, though. Immediately after the election, there was controversy. The projects were behind budget. They were not coming along line as fast as the mayor had said he would build them. So they were behind budget, behind schedule. And I think a year and a half later after that vote, if the citizens could have voted again to get it back out, they probably would have. Because maps was more controversial than ever. Now we're in the mid-90s, and in the wake of kind of that negativity, we're struck with the largest act of domestic terrorism in United States history. So a bomb goes off downtown. 168 people are murdered on a weekday morning. And I think it's important to kind of take a snapshot of Oklahoma City at this juncture. This was a generation of people that had already been through that rough economic time of the 80s. They'd been promised hope with United Airlines, had it dashed. They'd been promised hope with this MAPS initiative, and here we were a year or two later, and nothing good had come out of MAPS. And now, weighing on their collective shoulders was the emotional baggage of this mass murder. And something almost magical happened in those years after the bombing. It's as if the citizens of Oklahoma City kind of grabbed hands and pulled each other up and dared the world to pull us apart. The unity that was created out of those combined experiences is like something I don't know that I've ever seen anywhere in American history. And when you think about it, just as two people who go through an emotional experience have a certain relationship or a certain acknowledgement that really nobody else can understand because they went through it together, this was an entire city that had been through those emotional experiences. And that binding created an incredible unity that the city, to a certain extent, still lives on today, even some 20 years later. Now, let's move ahead with the story. The best thing that never happened was getting United Airlines, was not getting United Airlines, because United went bankrupt in the 90s. That facility that was built in Indianapolis never reached the job expectation. There's supposed to be 5,000 to 10,000 jobs, never got there. The building got shuttered. Indianapolis eventually did something else with it. But here's the thing to think about. If Oklahoma City would have got United Airlines, presumably United still would have gone bankrupt, and we never would have passed MAPS. Not getting United taught us a lesson, and it also was the best thing that never happened to us. We also, over a 25-year period, have diversified our economy. We had learned through generations of hardship in Oklahoma that being so reliant on the oil and gas industry was not a good way to try and run a state economy. And so we invested heavily in aviation, biomedical, tourism, and ultimately technology. And today, Oklahoma City is a diversified economy. Now, the state of Oklahoma is still heavily involved and heavily reliant on the oil and gas industry. But Oklahoma City has diversified, and I think that's a lesson that city after city has to come to grips with. You've got to be diversifying your economy, and you've got to be attracting technology at the same time. All right, civic pride and social cohesion. I was elected mayor in 2004, and my predecessors, Ron Norick, who I mentioned, and his successor, Kirk Humphreys, did some incredible work. And I felt like by 2004 that the city was poised to kind of take off in a new economic dynamic. And I was trying to figure out how I was best going to tell that story, because I knew that the rest of the country was fairly unaware of Oklahoma City. There was really nothing to know. And as I traveled around the country talking about Oklahoma City and its new dynamic and this new trajectory of an economy that I was predicting, I realized the moment I said Oklahoma City, I could see it on people's faces, all they could think about was the bombing. I said Oklahoma City, they had a vision of that horrific day in 1995, and they could see that building, they could see whatever images had been seared into their brain, because that was probably the last time they thought about Oklahoma City. This was less than 10 years later, and there hadn't been anything happening in Oklahoma City to draw their attention since then, except maybe a tornado or something else that had been horrific. And so I realized that we were going to have to do something to improve our brand. Now, would you open that for me? Thanks. I will say that in the book, I talk about Louisville and its brand and how well-branded Louisville is. The Louisville Slugger, the Kentucky Derby, has all these social. Memphis is in a very similar situation. And because you live in Memphis, you probably don't realize it. But Memphis has a cultural identity that's around the world. And I don't have to go over the certain impacts of it, but keep in mind that things you probably take for granted. The university that plays Division I basketball. Oklahoma City was the largest city in the country without Division I basketball. We also didn't have any real cultural anecdotes to talk or discuss with. You said Oklahoma City and people just kind of looked at you with a blank stare because they didn't have any image of it that was positive. And I realized that, people had sympathy for us, but I can't build an economy on sympathy. And so I started going to New York, talking to the commissioner of the NBA and the NHL about bringing a team to Oklahoma City. We'll see if that stays or if it falls. We probably better put the cap on that. And Commissioner Stern in New York, the commissioner of the NBA, he was very interested in, I would say fascinated about my passion for getting an NBA team. We had built an arena and, we had no tenant. And he hadn't really thought much about Oklahoma City. We weren't really on his radar screen. But I know he didn't have a team for us because he said in his exact words, "I don't have a team for you." And I went to see him in August of 2004. I went back in January of 2005. I went back in March. And at this point, he called me the mayor who wouldn't go away. And he sat me down on that day and said, "Look, I know what you're trying to do. I know what you're trying to accomplish, and I appreciate all of that." He goes, "I'll tell you what, I'll try and help you get a hockey team." He knew Gary Bettman. They had once worked together in the NBA office. But he says, you don't need to keep coming back. I don't have a team that's going to be coming to Oklahoma City. Well, here comes September, and Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans. I spent 20 years in the news business, and so I knew one thing about hurricanes is that the water comes in, and then the water goes out. And so on Monday, the water came in to New Orleans. And on Tuesday, we all started watching the news and noticed the water didn't go back out. Much of New Orleans was under sea level, and you could tell over that Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday that this was a changed city, that business as usual was not going to be returning to New Orleans anytime soon. The arena had been damaged. People were wondering where the New Orleans Saints were going to play. And that's when I remembered that New Orleans had a basketball team, and I could tell their arena wasn't going to be ready in 6 weeks. And so I called Commissioner Stern, and he called me back about 3 hours later, and he said, "I didn't call you right back because I knew what you wanted." And lo and behold, 6 weeks later, we brought the New Orleans team into Oklahoma City for a 1-year trial. And our business community just blew it out of the park. We led the league in corporate sponsorships in a 6-week launch. We sold every ticket in a 6-week launch for the whole season. Well, at that point, the New Orleans franchise didn't want to go back. So the NBA negotiated with New Orleans. We got a 2nd year. And seeing that the New Orleans lease was pretty ironclad and that team was going to have to go back when the arena got fixed, the NBA gave them an all-star game to New Orleans, trying to figure out how they were going to address the lease down there because the team was flourishing in Oklahoma City. And our business leaders went and bought the Seattle franchise because it didn't seem like they were going to be able to build an arena and address the issues that Seattle was facing in its competitive environment. And so New Orleans franchise went back to New Orleans. We went 1 year without, and then the Seattle Sonics moved their franchise to Oklahoma City. And at that point, I felt like the branding of our city had been complete. Now you had something to identify with Oklahoma City that was positive for really the first time. And so now when you think of Oklahoma City, there's a much higher chance that you're going to be thinking about something positive. And since that time frame, the MBA has only grown its global footprint. I remember it's been a few years now, but I remember this woman came up to me and she said, "Mayor, I want you to know that I get it now." I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Well, when you were asking us to vote for that sales tax extension to improve the arena, to get that long-term deal with the NBA," she goes, "I like you, so I voted for it. But I really didn't understand why it was so important to us." And she said, "Well, I just got back from Turkey. And I got up in the morning and the guy came to get my bags and he said, 'Where are you going?' And she says, 'I'm going home to Oklahoma City.' And he said, 'Thunder.' And she said, 'When the bellman in Turkey knows my hometown,' he goes, 'I get it now. I understand the global impact of the MBA.' And I say that because I know you all are going through very similar experiences. Having an NBA franchise is a very special thing. And I think going forward, eventually there will be a division in Europe or somewhere else in the world. And the global footprint of the MBA is going to be more and more important and more valuable. And it's going to be more and more important that we keep that as a viable business in our communities. Civic pride and social cohesion is becoming more and more important because people want to be proud of where they live. Because of social media, the connectivity is more and more important. And in studying it, I'm learning the value of people who have moved into your community or even out of your community. Because in today's environment, and largely because of social media, but even without social media, people stay connected to people. And so opportunities exist when people come into your community or out of your community. What impression do they have? What sort of brand do you take with you? And how important are those connections? So anything you can do to stay connected with people that have left your city or that you're trying to invite to your city is more important than ever. You don't have to live in a city anymore to do business in a city. Pillar 3 is creating a culture of health and wellness. And I don't know how well you can see it, but that was me a couple of years after I was mayor. I had always battled weight gain. And so when I was elected mayor in 2004, I hardly noticed that I was gaining a little more weight than usual, but everybody wants to feed the mayor. And the mayor was eating. And then in 2006, we start showing up on what I'll call the lists. Now, the lists, what I'm talking about is, all these websites and magazines like to rank cities. Best city to do this, best city to do that. And really, for the first time ever, we were starting to show up on the list. Well, we'd never been on a list before. And it was kind of cool to be, best city to get a job, and we'd be number 18. Best city to start a business, and we'd be number 22. And we'd get all excited because it felt like we were somebody, We were ranked with cities we'd heard of, on lists. And then came out the list of the most obese cities in the country. And there we were, number 2. And I was embarrassed by it. No mayor wants their city to be on that list. But even more astonishing, I had no response. I had no action item. I didn't know what to say. In fact, I had spent the first couple of years of my mayorship explaining to people how health and wellness were really something that the county was worried about, and it really wasn't one of the responsibilities of City Hall. And I finally realized about this time in some self-examination that I don't really get to decide what my job responsibilities are. If people keep asking me about health and wellness, it's probably best that I assume the responsibility of health and wellness. And so I spent some time studying it, and I got on the scales, and I weighed 218 pounds. And I thought, well, that seems like a lot. And so I went to this website, and I typed in my height, and I typed in my weight, and I hit enter, and it said, obese. I thought, well, what a stupid website. I'm not obese. I would know if I was obese. And then I started getting a reality check, and I realized I'd gained 10 pounds a year my first 2 years as mayor. And all of a sudden, I realized I'm like 40 pounds overweight. And I'd become an example, as you can see here in this picture, I'd become an example of the problem that the city was facing. And so I still didn't know what to do about it from a global sense or a collective community sense, but I knew I needed to lose weight. And because I had lost weight before, I just stopped eating as much. I always exercised, so that really wasn't the problem. I just ate too much. So I stopped eating as much, and I lost about a pound a week for 40 weeks. And while I was losing this weight, I started for the first time in my life examining Oklahoma City, trying to figure out why we had an issue with obesity. And that's when I noticed that for the first time, really, our over-reliance on the automobile, how everything we built, the most important structure, the largest structure seemed to be how it dealt with the car. So in other words, the 2 and 3 and 4 car garages at every house. If we built a church, where are we going to drop people off? And so there'd be this huge automobile entryway. If we built a school, how are we going to drop kids off? And so, so every architectural feature almost seemed the most important part of it was how are we going to deal with cars? We had zoned the entire city for the automobile. We hadn't built sidewalks in decades. We actually, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when most of suburban Oklahoma City was constructed, we did not require developers to build sidewalks, and many didn't. And the result was we had built schools and parks and libraries and neighborhoods, but we had no connectivity to speak of. And I was examining all this and realizing, the built environment is a very expensive proposition to try and get in there and change. And there was also all of the social issue that went with it. And while I was trying to figure out how to deal with the obesity issue, I finally came to the conclusion, I don't really know how we're going to deal with it, but I do know this. The first thing has got to be a conversation, because I noticed that obesity was a subject that we weren't comfortable talking about. It's kind of invasive. It's not nice to talk negatively about people. And so our kind of unannounced strategy to deal with obesity was to ignore it and kind of hope it would go away on its own. I thought it was interesting that when we were placed on the list of the most obese cities in the country, that usually when you're on a negative list, there's all these efforts to discount the data. Government or whoever is in leadership and has a microphone in front of them talks about how the data is incorrect or misleading or how the actual facts are different from what this particular rating system had implied. When we were placed on the list of the most obese cities, we just kind of nodded and said, I bet that's right. And so to get a conversation started, I went to the zoo, which is what you see there, and stood in front of the elephants. And I announced that I was putting the entire city on a diet and we were going to lose 1 million pounds. And that's when all hell broke loose in Oklahoma City. But I'll say this, that if the only thing that happened was somebody at the water cooler said, did you hear what the crazy mayor did? They were talking about obesity for probably the very first time between two people. By bringing it out in the open and forcing a conversation, suddenly you could sense that it made it easier for husbands and wives to talk about it with their kids, over the backyard fence. Business leaders felt a little more leeway in talking about it with their employees. Church pastors started bringing it up in conversations with their parishioners and setting up support groups. We had a website, thiscityisgoingonadiet.com. And you could sign up, pledge to lose weight, and it would monitor your success. And so, people started rolling in. And I was on the Ellen DeGeneres show to talk about it at that particular time. And that day, we had 15,000 hits on the website. Ultimately, 47,000 people signed up. And we hit the 1 million pound mark 4 years later. 4 years and 3 weeks. And that's about 20 pounds apiece. But it also took a different level when, because the awareness campaign, which is really all it was, because it had penetrated the market so well, we were then able to go to the citizens and start passing initiatives to rebuild the built environment. And so we built hundreds of miles of sidewalks, completed our jogging and biking trail system, which we had no intentions of ever. We just had a plan. There was no funding for this plan until we funded it all in one time. We're also building senior health and wellness centers throughout the community to get ready for the baby boom generation and the healthcare needs and the intent of having have a wellness philosophy inside our community. And down on the river, that river that didn't have any water, we built the finest venue in the world for the sports of canoe, kayak, and rowing. And the Olympic trials for the last 2 years in kayak, last 2 Olympics, have been held in Oklahoma City. And it is all part of that wellness philosophy and a community that wants to get healthier. The health statistics are now coming out from the county because it's been 10 years since that episode at the zoo. And we are now performing better in every statistical category across the board: heart disease, cancers, and you see all of the wellness efforts that we've made, the awareness campaign, changing the built environment. It's all starting to improve some 10 years later. So it has been a journey, and I'm the most unlikely health expert you will ever meet, because the only thing I knew about obesity is that I was obese, and have learned a lot along the way, and have given a lot of examples. But I will leave you with this as far as the obesity awareness campaign goes. One of the reasons I think we were as successful as we were is that we never backed down from the fact that obesity was really about food intake. There were a lot of organizations around the world that saw what we had done and tried to emulate some aspect of it. And almost every case, what happened was they would talk about obesity, they would come up with some program, and when they left the room, they had an exercise program in place. And my message is, you're not going to exercise your way out of obesity. And really, the message on exercise should be universal. Everyone should exercise. By picking out the obese community and explaining that they need to exercise is really a misleading point. It's almost certainly about what a person eats and how much they eat. It's generally not going to be an exercise issue only. And I think that's one of the aspects of it that has hit home for Oklahoma City. The built environment was a significant problem. Our allegiance to the automobile was a significant problem. But counting calories and realizing that you have to watch what you eat is a significant part of the obesity equation. Environmental sustainability is getting involved in public transit and walkability, and realizing that as downtowns become more and more populated, people are going to expect more and more opportunities to move seamlessly through your community, not owning a car. I've seen the scooters on your streets. I see the scooter revolution, and I love the scooters. I don't know if they're going to be here in 5 years. I can't tell if it's a fad or if it's real, but I love it for now. And the mixed-use developments that I see here and that I see being created in so many urban environments, I think, are absolutely going in the right direction. And I got a wonderful tour today of the old Sears facility and saw the kind of utopia that's being created in there. And that's one of the best reuse projects I've ever seen. And maybe before that, I would have said, no, it was the pyramid was probably the best reuse project I'd ever seen. So you guys are at the top of the list in my travels on trying to figure out what to do with a building that has outlived its usefulness. So your creativity is acknowledged here, and I talk about it when I move around the country. Oklahoma City just opened up its streetcar system last month. We have 5 miles of streetcar in the downtown environment. So far so good, but it was free for the first month, and so it was packed and crowded and you couldn't hardly get on. Now we're charging, and so obviously there's fewer people riding it, but it seems like it's going to catch on. And I think it's part of this walkable experience that a streetcar can supplement the walkability of a downtown area. And you know, we all live in cities that we didn't create. And so this tremendous infrastructure that's in place today for the automobile is not going away. But we're going to have to make sure that we're spending a good percentage of our dollars going ahead on the types of transportation that people are now looking for. Public transit where it makes sense, but certainly experiences in walkability. It would be nice for every city to have at least an area of town where you could live and not have to own a car. And with the shared economy and the ride sharing that's going on, it seems like that's a more and more viable opportunity. So, you know, kind of summing up Oklahoma City's experience, probably the worst economy in the country in 1990. Today, arguably one of the best economies in the country. We consistently rank in the top 10 for jobs, opportunity, building a family. With the NBA, which seems like we're culturally relevant, but it really comes back to what Mayor Norrick learned in 1990, and that was that you've got to invest in yourself. That if you're not investing in yourself and in your own city, you're probably not going to be able to keep up with the larger economy. What it's really about, in a different way to look at it, it's about higher standards. I mentioned earlier that Oklahoma City kind of lost its attention to design. In a post-World War II America, my take is that in Oklahoma City, we were just trying to be so frugal, and everything we built was as cheap as possible if it was a government project. And you understand the philosophy. These are tax dollars. Why should we spend an extra dollar on anything? Well, you do that for a few decades, and you have Oklahoma City in 1990, a city that corporate America wasn't interested in any price. And the more I study it, the more I realize that you're not going to have businesses with high standards in a city with low standards. And as the mayor for 14 years, you can imagine I had a few opportunities to put people on committees and boards and trusts, and I mean literally over 1,000 times there was somebody's name, may have been, you know, continuing their service, but whatever. And I take pride in the fact that I never told anybody how to vote on a single issue. And occasionally they would ask for some direction, and I said, well, I'll give you this direction. From time to time, you're going to have an opportunity to raise the standards on something. I mean, it could be a plumbing inspector, it could be a downtown design review board. From time to time, there's going to be a chance to raise the level of expectations. Raise it. Because you can't do it all at once. You can't suddenly raise the standards on the private sector and what might be perceived as an additional expense for whatever reason. But through time, you can raise the standards of living in your community. And you have to build a community with higher and higher standards if you expect businesses with high standards to invest in your city and to build the corporate campuses and the types of buildings that we'd like to see them build in our city. Oklahoma City and Memphis are not alone in this journey. You know, the city of Austin gets a lot of attention for, you know, being one of the cities that was at one time a similar size as Oklahoma City and Memphis. And then with Dell Computers and a lot of the other technology investments that took place, it has, you know, soared in almost every metric. But now Austin is you know, becoming a city that has a lot of traffic congestion, where they're pricing a lot of their younger people out of living in the city. And so they're, through a lack of planning, have taken on some of the nuances of the city that they are, you know, soaring to be. And so I think there's a lesson here in the importance of public transit and investing in public transit. People don't like change. And when you change really, really fast, people get more and more upset. And I finally came to describe it this way because, gosh, no city's, you know, changed any more than Oklahoma City through the years. But there's really three types of people. There's one type of people who will say, I don't like change, don't change it. And then when you change something, you find out they were right. They don't like change and they're mad. There's another group of people, and this is a kind of a perplexing group, that they will say they like change, but then when you change it, you find out they were wrong. They don't like change either, and they're mad. And then there's a group that will tell you they like change, and they do like change. The problem is that group is extinct. That group does not exist. And so I exaggerate that point just to because I think there's this assumption that you're going to hear of some movement or some new idea, and you're going to think it's the greatest. You can't imagine anyone not liking this, this new idea or this new concept. There are going to be people that don't like it. And understand the leadership needs your support when they're instituting change. That has to be communicated. People have to understand why. And no matter how well-meaning or how beneficial it seems obvious, if you're changing something, there's a group out there that's going to fight that change. It is some sort of human instinct, and it can, if you allow it to, it can really keep a city from progressing the way that we think these cities have to continue to progress. But if you look at places around the world, let's look at a few cities. Des Moines. Anybody been to Des Moines lately? One person. All right. Well, you need to go to Des Moines because they're a city that has captured that downtown revival too. They have a river. In fact, I think it feeds into yours, if I'm not mistaken. But the point is that they had a lot of older infrastructure, 19th century infrastructure. It's pretty cool. But through the years and deferred maintenance, it became eyesore. And so, development on the river kind of got stagnated and forgotten. And they've gone in and reinvested in it. And they've also realized that one component of society that is just now getting the attention it deserves is food. Have you noticed what a food revolution is going on right now? I mean, how many shows about food do we need on television? I mean, there are entire channels devoted to food, but even the channels that aren't devoted to food are doing shows on food. Well, Des Moines always had a history in agriculture and food, and they've gone back and rediscovered that and are using food as a major way of introducing Des Moines back to society. In Tulsa, how long since you've been to Tulsa? Anyone been to Tulsa recently? You have? Was it in the last year? Yeah? Did you see the gathering place? Yeah, she says it's incredible. Tulsa has built what may be the finest urban park in the world. I'm going to let that sink in. Largely philanthropically funded, $450 million. You can build a lot of swing sets for $450 million. This is an unbelievable urban parking experience. Here's one thing interesting about it. The leadership of Tulsa, that's the mayor, G.T. Bynum, right there, and the philanthropist community that largely not only funded the capital expense, the city had a role, but it was largely philanthropically funded. They also have an endowment for the operations, so they don't ever have to worry about operating this park either. I know, it's amazing at every level. But they didn't build it for direct economic development benefit, which is different from what we do in Oklahoma City 100 miles away. Almost every time Oklahoma City invests in something, we want to know what the ROI is. We build a convention center, we build a park, we're looking for development along the sides. I mean, everything we do, we're looking for a payback and how we're going to build the economy through our investment. Tulsa was trying to socially bring the city together. They recognized that through years of cultural disenfranchisement, it seemed like there were groups of people in Tulsa that had not gotten along or had not been able to communicate or spend time together, and they just felt like they needed social cohesion. And so they built this park with the idea that everyone would feel welcome there. Now think about that as a social experience and a social experiment. But I urge you to come see this park. It is obviously going to have economic benefits, but I find it fascinating that they did not build it specifically for the economic development and the tourism that it will undoubtedly create. Columbus, Ohio, Every city out there is trying to figure out the autonomous vehicle and what's coming next. Columbus has probably been more successful than most in getting ready for the autonomous vehicle and starting to spur that technology around and along. They have invested heavily in technology and seem to be at the forefront of a lot of very interesting things. They're obviously the home of Ohio State University, and so they have that educational component. And it seems to me that when you start looking at cities that are punching above their weight, I would include Columbus in that. And they want to be the capital of the autonomous vehicles. And we'll see. And not far from here in Louisville, you may know that Mayor Greg Fisher has built an entire program around compassion. And I remember when Mayor Fisher told me about this, I did not understand what he was talking about. That did not seem like something a mayor should get involved in. What was that? I didn't understand it. And he just felt like that a compassionate community was going to excel on every other level that was important. And if you didn't have compassion, what kind of a community were you? Now, they've had racial strife in Louisville. We all know about Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali and the long-standing issues of the racial issues in Louisville. But Mayor Fisher wanted the compassion to be an integral part of his administration. He started with his own staff inside city government. He brought the Dalai Lama in to visit with his staff and ultimately to visit with the citizens of Louisville. And I point this out largely because it's so unique, and the more I think about it, the more I think Mayor Fisher is right. And every time I see something that I think is eye-opening in its own way, I think it's worthy of examination and to think about. They're building a park in Tulsa for what reason? Louisville's starting an initiative around compassion. I think these are interesting studies of leadership that we all can learn from. And we also know that with technology, the future is going to start changing on an ever more rapid pace. I suspect that the human body is built to accept change at a level of about this. I mean, it is not our instinct to accept drastic change. Now, some of us are more easily adaptable than others, but you kind of feel like we're starting to go like this in the future. And how are we as humans going to react to this incredible change that's taking place with not only the autonomous vehicle, but robotics in general, artificial intelligence? All of these things in our lifetime are going to significantly change the way that we conduct ourselves and build our cities and conduct our lives and raise our children and invest in education. And so, what do we do today to start fostering our cities to get better prepared for change? I think the cities that can, through communication and leadership, can figure out change and have a citizenry that's more accepting of change, the better off the city is going to be. And then there's always this issue of how are we going to pay for it? Sometimes I get way too much credit for being the enlightened Republican mayor. I can't tell you how many times I've been described that way. And when I think about it, I don't feel more enlightened. All of the things we've done in Oklahoma City, and I've seen it happen. I'm amazed at how far Oklahoma City has come. But the true key is that it wasn't that other mayors didn't want the same things that we were able to create. It's that we figured out ways to pay for it. And through creative financing and in a very red state. President Trump won all 77 counties. President Obama lost all 77 counties twice. That's how red the state of Oklahoma is. In that red state, we have passed a series of sales tax elections over and over again. In fact, the city hasn't lost an election in over 30 years of continually asking the citizens to reinvent the city, to fund infrastructure projects, to create quality of life initiatives. And that happens because of positive energy. It happens because the city has developed a reputation of doing what it said it was going to do. And even the most red conservative has trouble arguing with the results of the economic development that have taken place in Oklahoma City. Now, they consistently, speak against taxation, all those things that you might hear in other places, but it's hard to argue with the results of Oklahoma City's ascension. And the absence of scandal, the doing what you say you're going to do, through 30 years now, there's a bond that's been created through the voters and the elected officials. And it seems like that the voters have kind of distinguished in the type of taxation they're willing to consider. It seems like they like the fact that with our MAPS initiatives at least, we incur no debt. And so we collect the penny on the dollar sales tax and then we start the process of building it. Now it takes longer to build the projects this way. But I still remember when I was trying to convince Commissioner Stern to bring an NBA team to Oklahoma City, I told him about this wonderful arena. And he said, "How much debt do you have on that arena?" And I said, "None. We paid cash." And he looked at me like I had invented plutonium. He said, "What do you mean you paid cash?" And I explained the process. You see, almost every NBA team out there has some sort of note that they're expecting the team to help pay off. And Oklahoma City, we were desperate for a team, and we understand in a small market you have to do things that in the big cities they don't have to do. And so offering a debt-free arena as part of the arrangement was a significant selling point. And it really helps the NBA business model, and in trying to get the NBA to expand to a new market, something like that was a significant difference maker. But it also, I think, is a bullet point for a conservative political climate. The citizens kind of like the fact that there's no debt with it. They don't like debt. They don't like government debt. They hear too much of government debt. And I'm not saying we don't borrow money. We have bond issues too for other infrastructure projects. But with that program, and it's the most widely known initiative in the state, there is no debt. And we've got about $2 billion now that have been raised. Government doing what it says it's going to do is an extremely important component, developing that bond. It's not hard to get someone to vote no. To get somebody to vote yes, you kind of have to convince them. But to get somebody to vote no, it almost seems like you just have to kind of talk about some hidden agenda, or some guys that you don't know are going to get rich because of this. Or my favorite kind of talking point to get someone to vote no is say, vote no on this one and they'll bring something back that you like. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, these things aren't written on the back of a napkin, where you just bring them up, another weekend. I mean, they take years to put together. Initiatives are precious, and it's very important to pass whatever you bring up, whether it's a school bond issue, or it's a city issue, or it's a sales tax. It's important to keep that positive energy. The other aspect of this is that it's important that positive momentum has something coming. And Memphis has been very fortunate that it seems like in this community, you've always got something coming. There's always something that's coming next. And there may have been lulls in that continuum through the years, and you felt it. But in Oklahoma City, for 30 years now, people have always known there was something coming. We've always had another initiative that was building a project and opening something up. And so the advantage is our citizenry had opportunities to talk to their family and friends in other places, and they'd be excited about something that was coming. So the streetcar opened last month. Well, we have a convention center under construction. We have a new park that's not like Tulsa's park, but it's a nice park. It's a $130 million urban park. It'll open up in September. There's always something coming that they can talk about with enthusiasm. My dad once told me that happiness is looking forward to something. You think about that as a human instinct. A city always needs to be looking forward to something that's coming out of the ground. And for that reason, you can't ever think you're done. You're finished. City's just the way you want it to be. And it's an example that building a city is just a journey that you never arrive at your destination. You got to keep investing. You got to keep reimagining, because the world's changing, and even though it may seem like change is tough, people expect new things on a continual basis. And you have to have positive energy if you want people to vote yes for something. My Twitter handle, @Mick Cornett. If somebody will tweet, the people in Oklahoma will know that I made it. If you'll tag me there at @Mick Cornett. The book is The Next American City. It's doing really well. I just got back from Abu Dhabi, that's, I tell you, they don't have funding issues in the UAE. But they're just as interested as we are about creating cities where people want to live, that attract people. And so, city building is going on in all parts of the world, and these same principles are being put into use. And so, I'll leave you with, just some comments from the guy from out of town, that you guys are doing a lot of things right. And I've been to Memphis like 5 times in the last 6 years, and every time I come away with things that I can go back and tell people about what I'm seeing. And I know it's not easy. I know I've talked with enough people that live here to know the struggles of government and placemaking, and you guys have overcome all of the issues that have come, or at least some of them that have come up. And I could recognize that, because in Oklahoma City, I'm telling you, we've come further than any city ever has, but Memphis never bottomed out the way Oklahoma City did either, and you don't want to. So I think you guys are doing a lot of things right, and I applaud you. And I hope you'll check out the book. It talks about a lot of the things that I've discussed and a lot more, and the things I've learned along the way about how we're creating the city of tomorrow and creating cities for the future that are going to continue to attract young people. Thanks very much. Thank you.